The Bloody Shirt elects Grant. The Republicans nominated Civil War General Ulysses S. Grant, who was a great soldier but had no political experience. The era of good stealings. Despite the Civil War, the population still mushroomed, partially due to immigration, but during this time, politics became very corrupt. Depression, deflation, and inflation. In 1873, a paralyzing panic broke out, the Panic of 1873, caused by too many railroads and factories being formed in existing markets could bear and the overloading by banks to those projects. Essentially, the cause of the panic were the same old ones that caused recent recessions every 20 years that century. One, over speculation, and two, too easy credit. Pallid politics in the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was a term coined by Mark Twain hinting that times looked good, yet if one scratched a bit below the surface, there were problems. Times were filled with corruption and presidential election squeakers, even though Democrats and Republicans had special ideas on economic issues. There were fundamental differences. Compromise of 1877 and the end of Reconstruction. The Electoral Count Act, passed in 1877, set up an electoral commission that consisted of 15 men selected from the Senate, the House, the Supreme Court, and the would count votes. The 15th man was to be an independent, David Davis, but at the last moment he resigned. Garfield and Arthur. James A. Garfield. In 1880, the Republicans nominated James A. Garfield, a man from Ohio who had risen to the rank of Major General in the Civil War, and his running mate, a notorious stalwart supporter of Roscoe Conkling, was chosen, Chester A. Arthur of New York. Chester A. Archer didn't seem to be a good fit for the presidency, but he surprised many by giving the cold shoulder to stalwarts, his chief supporters, and by calling for reform, a call heeded by a Republican Party as it began to show newly found enthusiasm for reform. Old Grover takes over. Portly Grover Cleveland was the first Democratic president since James Buchanan, and as a supporter of laissez-faire capitalism, he delighted business owners and bankers. The new Speaker of the House, Thomas B. Reed, was a large, tall man and tremendous debater and a very critical and quick man he founded the Billion-Dollar Congress. Cleveland and Depression. Grover Cleveland won, but no sooner than he had stepped into the presidency did the Depression of 1893 break out. The iron colt becomes an iron horse. After the Civil War, railroad production grew enormously from 35,000 miles of track laid in 1865 to a whopping 192,556 miles of track laid in 1900, spanning the continent with rails. Over in California, the Central Pacific Railroad was in charge of extending the railroad eastward, and it was backed by the Big Four, including Leland Stanford, the ex-governor of California, who had useful political connections, and Claus B. Huntington, an adept lobbyist. Revolution by railways. Railways stitched the nation together, generated a huge market and lots of jobs, helped the rapid industrialization of America, and stimulated mining and agriculture in the West by bringing people and supplies to and from the areas where such work occurred. Wrongdoing in railroading. Railroads were not without corruption, as shown by the Credit Mobilier scandal. Jay Gould made millions embezzling stocks from the Erie, Kansas Pacific, the Union Pacific, and the Texas Pacific Railroad companies. The trust titan emerges. Industry giants use various ways to eliminate competition and maximize profits. Andrew Carnegie used a method called vertical integration, which meant that he bought out and controlled all aspects of an industry. John D. Rockefeller, master of horizontal integration, simply allied with or bought out competitors. Government tackles the trust evil. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was signed into law. It forbade combinations, trusts, pools, interlocking directories, holding companies in restraint of trade without any distinction between good or bad trusts. Labor limps along. The Civil War put a premium on labor, which helped labor unions grow. The urban frontier. From 1870 to 1900, the American population doubled and the population in cities tripled. The lust for learning. A new trend began in the creation of more public schools and the provision of free textbooks by taxpayers. By 1900, there were 6,000 high schools in America. Kindergartens also multiplied. Booker T. Washington and education for black people. The South, war-torn and poor, lagged far behind in education, especially for blacks, so Booker T. Washington, an ex-slave, came to help. He started by heading a black normal teacher in industrial school in Tuskegee, Alabama, and teaching the students useful skills and trades. The appeal of the press. Libraries such as the Library of Congress also opened across America, bringing literature into people's homes. Families and women in the city. Urban life was stressful on families who were often separated, and everyone had to work, even children as young as 10 years old. While on farms, more children meant more people to harvest and help, but in the cities, more children meant more mouths to feed and a greater chance of poverty. Prohibition of alcohol and social progress. Concern over the popularity and dangers of alcohol was also present, marked by the formation of the National Prohibition Party in 1869. Other organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union also rallied against alcohol, calling for a national prohibition of the beverage. Clash of cultures on the plains. After the Civil War, the Great West was still relatively untamed, wild, full of Indians, bison, and wildlife, and sparsely populated by a few Mormons and Mexicans. In the 1860s, the U.S. government intensified its efforts by herding Indians into smaller and smaller reservations like the Dakota Territory, bellowing herds of bison. In the early days, tens of millions of bisons dotted the American prairie, and by the end of the Civil War, there were still 15 million buffalo grazing, but it was the eruption of the railroad that really started the Buffalo Massacre. The Farmer's Frontier. The Homestead Act of 1862 allowed folks to get as much as 160 acres of land in return for living on it for 5 years, improving it, and paying a nominal fee of $30. Or it allowed folks to get land after only 6 months residence for $1.25 an acre. The Far West comes of age. The Great West experienced a population surge as many people moved onto the frontier. New states like Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming were admitted to the Union. The fading frontier. The frontier was a state of mind and a symbol of opportunity. The safety valve theory stated that the frontier was like a safety valve for folks who, when it became too crowded in their area, they could simply pack up and leave, moving west. The farm became a factory. Farmers were now increasingly producing single cash crops since they could then concentrate their efforts, make profits, and buy manufactured goods from mail order companies such as the Aaron Montgomery Ward catalog, first in 1872, or from Sears. Deflation dooms the debtor. In 1880, when world markets rebounded, produced more crops, and forced prices down, farmers in America were the ones that found ruin. Unhappy farmers. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, droughts, grasshopper plagues, and searing heat waves made the toiling farmers miserable and poor. The farmers take their stand. In the Greenback movement after the Civil War, agrarian unrest had flared forth as well. Prelude to populism. The Farmers Alliance, founded in 1870, was another coalition of farmers seeking to overthrow the chains from the banks and railroads that bound them. The Coxey's Army and the Pullman Strike. The Panic of 1893 fueled the passion of the populace. The Pullman Strike in Chicago, led by Eugene Debs, was more dramatic. Workers struck, sometimes violently. U.S. Attorney General Richard Olney called in federal troops to break up the strike. His rationale: the strike was interfering with the transit of U.S. mail. America turns outward. From the end of the Civil War to the 1880s, the United States was very isolationist, but in the 1890s, due to rising exports, manufacturing capability, power, wealth, it began to expand outward onto the world stage, using overseas markets to sell its goods. Spreading the Hawaiian Pier. From 1820s, when the first U.S. missionaries came, the United States had always liked the Hawaiian Islands. The Cubans rise and revolt. In 1895, Cuba revolted against Spain, citing years of misrule, and the Cubans torched their sugar cane fields in hope that such destruction would either make Spain leave or America interfere. On February 15th of that year, the U.S. battleship USS Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 260 officers and men. Dewey's May Day victory at Manila. On paper, at least, the Spanish had an advantage over the U.S. since it had more troops and a supposedly better army, as well as younger and seemingly more daring generals. The confused invasion of Cuba. The Spanish sent warships to Cuba, panicking Americans on the eastern seaboard, and the fleet, commanded by Admiral Cervera, found refuge in Santiago Harbor, Cuba. Then it was promptly blockaded by a better American force. Americans' curse or course of empire. In negotiations with Paris, America got Guam and Puerto Rico and freed Cuba, but the Philippines were a tough problem since America couldn't honorably give it back to Spain after decades of misrule, but the U.S. couldn't just take it like an imperialistic nation. New horizons in two hemispheres. The Spanish-American War lasted only 113 days and affirmed America's presence as a world power. The brandisher of the big stick. 6 months later, deranged murderer shot and killed William McKinley, making Theodore Roosevelt the youngest president ever at age 42. Born into a rich family and graduated from Harvard, he was highly energetic and spirited, and his motto was speak softly and carry a big stick, or basically let your actions do the talking. TR's preservation of the Monroe Doctrine. Latin American nations like Venezuela and Dominican Republic were having a hard time paying their debts to their European debtors. So Britain and Germany decided to send a bit of force to South America to make the Latinos pay. TR feared that if the European powers interfered in the Americas to collect their debts, they might stay in Latin America, in blatant violation of the Monroe Doctrine. So he issued his Roosevelt Corollary, which stated in the future cases of debt problems, the U.S. would take over and handle any intervention in Latin America on behalf of Europe, thus keeping away and the Monroe Doctrine intact. Progressive roots. In the beginning of the 1900s, America had 76 million people, mostly in good condition. Then before the first decade of the 20th century, the U.S. would be influenced by a progressive movement that fought against monopolies, corruption, inefficiency, and social injustice. The purpose of the progressives was to use the government as an agency of human welfare. Progressive women. Women were an indispensable catalyst in the progressive army. They couldn't vote or hold political office, but were active nonetheless. Women focused their changes on family-oriented ills such as child labor. TR's Square Deal for Labor. The progressivism spirit touched President Roosevelt, and his Square Deal embraced the three C's: control of the corporations, consumer protection, and the conservation of the United States natural resources. TR corrals the corporations. The 1887 formed Interstate Commerce Commission had proven to be inadequate, so in 1903 Congress passed the Elkins Act, which fined railroads that gave rebates and the shippers that accepted them. TR did crack down on over 40 trusts, and he helped dissolve the beef, sugar, fertilizer, and harvester trust, but in reality, he wasn't as large of a trust buster as he had been portrayed. He had no wish to take down the good trusts, but the trusts that did fall under TR's big stick fell symbolically, so that other trusts would reform themselves. The Roosevelt Panic of 1907. TR had widespread popularity, such as the teddy bear, but conservatives branded him as a dangerous rattlesnake, unpredictable in his progressive moves. Taft, a round peg in a square hole. William Taft was a mild progressive, quite jovial, quite fat, and passive. He was also sensitive to criticism and not as liberal as Roosevelt. The dollar goes abroad as diplomat. Taft urged Americans to invest abroad in a policy called dollar diplomacy, which called for Wall Street bankers to loose their surplus dollars into foreign areas of strategic concern to the U.S. Taft the Trustbuster. In his 4 years of office, Taft brought 90 suits against trusts. In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered the dissolution of the Standard Oil Company. Taft splits the Republican Party. The two main issues split the Republican Party: one, the tariff, and two, the conservation of lands. To lower the tariff and fulfill a campaign promise, Taft in the House passed a moderately reductive bill, but the Senate, led by Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, tacked on lots of upward revisions, and thus when the Payne-Aldrich bill passed, it betrayed Taft's promise, incurred the wrath of his party, drawn mostly from the Midwest, and outraged many people. Old Republicans were high tariff, new progressive Republicans were low tariff. Taft even foolishly called it the best bill that the Republican Party ever passed.